Welcome to the High Museum. Thank you for coming to hear me talk about some of the things I've learned in 3 years of studying the work and the life of Ulysses Davis. First, I'm going to briefly review the artist's career, so we're all at about at least a basic minimum level of knowledge, and then I'm going to go into some of the themes that are less familiar to most audiences and go into those in more depth, some of the themes in his artwork. Ulysses Davis was born in 1914 in Fitzgerald, Georgia, where he grew up. When he was still a child, he taught himself to cut hair and to carve wood. He had to leave school early in order to help support the family, and he went to work as a blacksmith's assistant on the ABC Railroad, which has now been incorporated into the CSX network. In 1933, he married Walter Elizabeth Willis of Millen, and she gave him 3 daughters and 6 sons. In 1942, Davis followed his job to Savannah. Then, with the decline of the railroads in the early 50s, he was laid off in 1951. When that happened, he drew on the skills that he'd learned as a child and opened a barber shop behind his house on West 45th Street in Savannah. Waiting for customers also gave him more opportunity to practice his carving, which was something he'd never given up. Davis kept his carvings in his barber shop, which is where you see him here, and that created a gallery and a sort of informal classroom where he would talk to visitors about American history, religion, and African American culture. Beginning with the citywide hobby show in 1953, Davis gradually began to gain recognition for his sculpture. His work was included in 1976 in Missing Pieces, Georgia Folk Art 1770 to 1976, which was organized by the Georgia Council for the Arts, toured in Georgia, and then in 1978, when the Carter administration was in office, went to the National Folklife Center, through the American Folklife Center, went to the Library of Congress, where it was exhibited as the American Folklife Center's first exhibition. You see him in this photo at the show, presenting a portrait bust to Jimmy Carter. He carved several portraits of Carter, in fact. We have 2 in the show. He carved at least 5. He was very proud of Georgia's home president. In 1982, he was included in the Corcoran Gallery's breakthrough touring exhibition, Black Folk Art in America, 1930 to 1980. He was profiled by George Crawley for CBS Evening News in 1984. And in 1988, he received the Governor's Award for the Arts from Governor Joe Frank Harris. He continued to be featured in group and solo shows until his death in 1990. Davis had always sold his work reluctantly. He wanted to keep the collection together to teach children his lessons of history and culture and religion, and to teach them what a black man could accomplish if he had abilities and determination. After he died, his family sold the collection, as he wished, to the King Tisdale Cottage Foundation in Savannah, an African American cultural center. They now house 238 of his 330-plus carvings. Davis's carvings of patriotic themes and portraits are the works by which he's best known to most of the public. They made up the largest group of carvings in the Corcoran exhibition and in most subsequent shows. Here are 2 superb examples of the artist's patriotic carvings. On the left is the first Ulysses Davis carving, the High Acquired. He created this gold-plated Statue of Liberty when he was just 25. You can see even in this early carving the meticulous carving technique, attention to detail, and fascination with texture that marked his work throughout his lifetime. The polychrome piece on the right is Uncle Sam, carved to commemorate the bicentennial. The face of Uncle Sam, as you see, is very finely rendered. On the base, the dates 1776 and 1976 are carved in freestanding letters. In this work, we see the artist's maturity appearing not in technical virtuosity. Davis was already a strikingly talented carver in his 20s, but in the freedom and imagination of Uncle Sam's configuration. Over the course of 40 years, he had grown far more confident in his own formal abilities. When you go downstairs, look carefully behind the front leg of the base here, and you will find, as I did, a delightful little surprise, a tiny equestrian figure that I suppose represents Paul Revere. This is one of those delightful little curatorial surprises that we get when we've only seen an artwork we admire in pictures, and then we finally get to see it for the first time live. And it reveals all kinds of new wonders to us. Davis's best-known work, the one most people regard as his masterpiece, is his series of portraits of all the presidents from George Washington through George H.W. Bush. Bush was in office when Davis died. Here's a sample of two of those presidents. Taken individually, each is an interesting exercise in folk carving, folk portraiture. Taken together as a group, they form a powerful work of installation art that testifies to their maker's patriotism. When you look at them downstairs, pay close attention to the hair on each figure. Their maker, the barber, certainly did. In addition to these familiar portraits, Davis explored other groups of people and other ideas. On the right, you see Frederick Douglass, one of Davis's many portraits of prominent African Americans. On the left is a piece he often called a Madonna, or the goddess of love and peace. It's a tribute to his wife and was carved the year after she died. It takes its form directly from that of the Infant of Prague, a Catholic devotional statue. The only change Davis made was to substitute for the cross that the Infant of Prague holds in its atop the orb that it holds. He substituted a heart with the word love across it. The piece is adorned with stones and beads from his wife's cast-off dresses and costume jewelry. He liked the allure that such twinklets, as he called them, gave his works. And in this case, they also imbue this carving with a sense of Elizabeth Davis's physical presence. As with many of his carvings, the surface of the goddess is enriched with patterning that Davis created by texturing the piece. Texturing the piece using stamps or punches that he made himself, drawing on his skills as a metal worker that he'd gained as a blacksmith's assistant. Carvings illustrating Bible stories or representing religious figures are also well known among Davis's works. They too are well represented in the Corcoran and subsequent shows. Here are two lovely depictions of characters from the Bible. The figure of Moses, who led the Israelites to freedom, has been a favorite of self-taught artists of color for a long time, and Davis was no exception. This is one of several images of the Patriarch that he carved. Here, Moses receives the Ten Commandments atop Mount Sinai. The mountainous terrain is brilliantly conveyed by the incised line below the figure. Here. The figure of Ruth, ancestor of Christ, is another early work, carved when Davis was about 29. In her right hand, she holds a sheaf of grain from her gleaning. Notice how the artist has lifted her skirt so he could carve her legs. A little bit of youthful showing off, perhaps. Again, we see the intense interest in texture, from the laces on her bodice to the differently patterned fabrics of her costume to the striations of the wood of the base. But there are other less familiar sides to Davis's religious images. On the left, the angel Gabriel tops a sculpture that evokes the theme of Christian redemption. Gabriel, the angel of the Annunciation, stands guard over a relief carving of Christ crowned with thorns. On the back of the base, which you can't see, is an image of the Virgin Mary. The middle tier, here, bears a row of palm leaves, symbols of Christ's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the event that ensures his arrest and execution. But on the sides of the base, here, you'll have to see these in person downstairs. They are four dwarf-like figures straight out of Snow White that Davis identified as creatures making a joyful noise to the Lord. They're irresistible, especially when you realize that one of them has his hands clapped over his ears. The tomb of Pontius Pilate on the right looks like a carnival ride to me, equipped with wheels and feet, like that teacup ride. It's going in several directions at once. Of course, it also looks like a baby carriage with the devil on the end of it. There. Davis's son, Michael, told me that it combines the ideas of Pilate and Rosemary's baby, who was the devil incarnate. We also know that Davis had shame in mind. He said he left the coffin open so that Pilate's face could be seen. Very few people realize that Davis also created abstract representations of spiritual concepts. Here are two of them. On the left is an elaborate carving that looks rather like a wedding cake, but it's not just decorative. Davis titled it The Upper Room. At the top is a finial composed of 3 hearts, probably representing the Trinity. Below that is a rose with another inside of it, right in here. That represents Davis's conception of the peace of heaven, which he regarded as a place so peaceful that one flower, he said, would grow out of another. It's a symbol that we find recurring in his work. Below that again is a row of palm leaves. And again we find the theme of Christian salvation depicted with startling originality. At the end of his life, Davis created sculptures of graduated golden spheres. His friend and dealer, Jimmy Allen, has said that they represent the translation of the soul from the earthly plane to the heavenly. Thus they convey, again, the artist's conviction of salvation. Although they are less often seen in his religious and patriotic sculptures and portraits, Davis lavished attention throughout the last half of his life on objects in the next 2 categories. The first is a group of carvings with an African look. Davis wanted to be thought of as American first. So when asked, he said he never looked at pictures of African art. But as you'll see, he clearly did. Beginning in 1975, Anheuser-Busch produced a PR campaign of great kings and queens of Africa. They commissioned portrait paintings of historic historic African rulers by African American artists. Then they reproduced those images on bar mirrors, posters, and calendars and other promotional materials. It's well known that Davis created a group of carved portraits using the images from one of those calendars as his model. You see here Hannibal and the original painting by Charles Lilly in the Anheuser-Busch collection that was reproduced on the calendar. These works could really be in a category by themselves. In concept, they have more in common with Davis's portraits than with the African works we're about to see. But formally, they tend to bridge that gap. Here you see Hannibal and the reproduction from the calendar. The treasure of Ulysses Davis includes 5 of these portraits, 5 of the 9 that Davis made. Davis may have said at one time that he didn't look at African sculpture. But there's plenty of evidence that he did, both anecdotal and visual. He read widely, visited the library regularly, and had his own library of books of African culture and history in the barber shop. The visual evidence is equally persuasive. You see here his version of the Ujamaa form, originated by the Makonde people of Tanzania. The Ujamaa, with figures of descendants at the top supported by their ancestors, symbolizes the interconnectedness of African village society and illustrates certain precepts of African socialism. And I dare say Davis was not looking at the latter of those ideas. But he's created a straightforward Ujamaa, which he named after the people who made it. He called it Makonde, rather than naming it after the sculptural form itself. The rich black surface of the piece is a finish we see often on Davis's Africanized carvings. It echoes an aesthetic preference for such surfaces found in artworks from people all over the African continent. The legend of the lost tribes of Israel was a theme Davis returned to several times. In the 8th century BC, 10 of the 12 original tribes of Israel were forced out of their ancestral home on the banks of the Jordan River. Their disappearance has given rise to legends and theories concerning their whereabouts. Groups in sub-Saharan Africa, notably the Lemba, display cultural similarities with Jewish groups. The idea of a link between biblical peoples and Africans certainly would have appealed to Davis as a student of both the Old Testament and a man of African descent. Furthermore, the story links two population dispersals, the African diaspora and the Jewish diaspora. The African-looking heads here are set in a menorah-like configuration, which in turn is set on a boat with alligators or crocodiles prowling the side, an idea Davis probably borrowed from pictures of 15th century salt cellars from Sierra Leone, like the one you see on the right. This is a motif that appears again and again in these salt cellars. The resonance of the Jewish diaspora with the African diaspora suggests that the placement of the lost tribe on a ship may allude to the dangers and dislocations of the Middle Passage and the slave trade. Here we see the most elaborate version he constructed of the lost tribes. And I'm going to do a little quick fact check here. Haywood, is this the sculpture you cut apart for Davis? Okay, good. According to sculptor Haywood Nichols, Davis appeared at his shop one day with a totem pole-like carving of stacked male heads, which he asked Nichols to cut apart. Nichols said he did so quite reluctantly. Davis reappeared several weeks later with this construction. Davis often constructed his sculptures, carving them in parts and then assembling them later. By the time he created this and other similar sculptures, he had nothing left to prove in that regard. Here are two more pieces that demonstrate Davis's familiarity with African sculptural forms. Again, we see the shiny black surface prized in parts of West Africa and the oversized heads that appear all over the continent, where the head is viewed as the seat of character and power. The flex-kneed stance of the figure on the right has prototypes all over West Africa, from the Congo to the Côte d'Ivoire. On the left, we have Count Dracula, in which Davis has combined a Western cultural figure with African sculptural forms with delightful results. On the right, we see a minor example of Davis's genius for disassembling and reassembling body parts, sometimes, as here, from different species. The head at the bottom is human, the head at the top is human, the head on the bottom, goat. The gaily painted nails of the figure reappear in Davis's work, as does the combination of white and red accents, which are sacred colors in much of West and Central Africa, and so appear often in sculpture from those regions. In other words, they're something that Davis would have seen a lot. Here are two more examples of bodies in unexpected configurations. In the carving on the left, the relationship between the two heads appears entirely different when seen from the front as it does when seen from the side. Then it's apparent that the bottom head springs out of the top head's giant feet, as you'll see when you go downstairs and see it. On the right is an elaborate and regal composition of displaced heads, One assumes that that piece refers to lynching, since Davis gave it the title of Billie Holiday's famous song on that subject. But if so, the references are too deeply coded for me to work them out. In all of Ulysses Davis's body of work, perhaps nothing is more surprising than the apparent lack of interest in which past curators have met the menagerie of fantastic beasts he nurtured in his imagination. Davis sometimes took his ideas from the Bible, from the books of Daniel or Revelation. Other times, the creatures were entirely his conception, and in these, we see his three-dimensional imagination really take flight. Here are a pair of fantastic animals inspired by two of the beasts the biblical prophet Daniel saw in his dreams. This is from the 7th chapter of Daniel. Daniel spake and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse from one another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wings. I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, and it was lifted up from the earth, and made stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second, like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had 3 ribs in the mouth of it between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, Arise, devour much flesh. After this I beheld, and lo, another like a leopard, which had upon the back of it 4 wings of a fowl. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, dreadful and terrible, and strong exceedingly, and it had great iron teeth. It devoured and brake in pieces, and stamped the residue with the feet of it. And it was diverse from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. You can see, you will see in the next, this slide and the next one, that Davis did use artistic license in interpreting these beasts, but they're clearly recognizable. Here are the other 2 from that same dream. The one on the right is particularly appealing, with her coy gesture looking back over her shoulder, flashing her dragon lady nails, breathing fire through her glitter-encrusted nostrils. Davis described many of his fantasy animals as created beasts, which he said were from dinosaur days. The example on the left has a bull-like form, but its fierceness is obliterated by the puppy-like expression on its face. The protruding tongue you see on that creature is one of Davis's favorite motifs. Again, you see the red and white accents. The creature on the right, with its high patterned base, is a little bit triceratops, a little bit armadillo, a little bit house cat. Davis named him Stumpy. The spines along his back are made either from toothpicks or from the broken teeth of a comb. Another creature from dinosaur days, the no-no bird, is a great favorite of the High's staff. He's so named because of his stunted wings. Unable to fly, he was a no-no to his creator. Of the many lizard-like creatures Davis invented, none is more spectacular than the many-headed beast on the right. Although Davis didn't identify him with Daniel's visions, he does share their winged form and multiplicity of heads. Again, we see the protruding tongue. Davis's creatures from another planet gave him yet another opportunity to dissolve and recombine body parts. The 2 busts on the left have an unusual number of facial features. Notice how adeptly Davis has fitted these features into a face shape that was never designed for them. The Emperor of Mars on the right is a tour de force of imaginary anatomy, blending furniture and sentient being into one form. Is the Emperor just a torso, or is his throne part of his body? The barely formed mask of his face increases the sense of uncertainty. Davis once ran a furniture repair business out of his barber shop, and you'll notice the ball and claw feet and the gooseneck rocker-inspired arms. Davis sometimes drew his subject matter from classical themes. On the left is his version of a centaur. Although he'd read about how the centaur was put together, how and where its human and equine parts were joined, he decided he'd prefer to place the human torso on the haunches rather than the withers, so that it could, in effect, turn around and look at itself. Then he caused the tail to sprout out of the human head. He embellished this elegant piece with finely carved golden hearts for the crown, tail, and base decorations, and a collar embellished with his beloved twinklets. And then he named it Get Off My Back. I know you're eager to move downstairs and view these remarkable objects in person. So the last carving we're going to look at on screen today is the hilarious painted devil. Necklace, pigeon-breasted, its bandy legs ending in cloven feet, with a stinger on its tail and 3 horns erupting from its head. It is completely realized. In viewing sculptures like these, whose forms Davis generated from within his own head, without a 2-dimensional model as he had for the presidents and the kings and queens of Africa, we can begin to understand both how fundamentally 3-dimensional his thinking was and what a rich and vivid world he inhabited in his own mind. Thank you for your attention.
Are there any questions?
Just a second.
Oh, sorry.
I have other plans.
Oh, sorry.
Before I answer any questions that you may have, I'd like to recognize a number of guests who are in our audience today. And some of them may have appeared since the lights went down. So if you're out there, please let me know. First of all, our lenders. First, the board of the King Tisdale Cottage Foundation, who generously agreed to lend the very best of their fine collection for Ulysses Davis carvings for the show. And the private collectors who also entrusted their prized artworks to us. Both enriched the exhibition enormously. Could you stand up briefly? Or just raise your hands. Thank you. Is Larry Chisholm here? No. Okay. Oh, really? Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Larry is the chairman of the board of the King Tisdale Cottage Foundation. And Marcus Johnson, who is here, is the program director there. Without their enthusiastic cooperation, this exhibition and catalog would never have come to pass. So, Marcus, would you please stand up and take a very well-deserved round of applause? Now, we're going down to the gallery in a few minutes where we can mingle with Davis' friends and family, people who knew him personally. They were luckier than I. And so I'm going to introduce those people now so you'll have an idea of who they are when you get down there. Several members of the artist's family helped me with this project in countless ways. They let me pick their brains about their relative. They clarified all kinds of ambiguities. They checked the catalog essay for errors of fact. And they supported the project in every way they could. They've done a sensational job marketing the show. We're privileged to have with us as many as 25 of Ulysses Davis's descendants, most of them grandchildren and their descendants. Will you all stand, please? Good. I could never have written a significant essay on Ulysses Davis without 2 of his colleagues who supplemented the family's information with details about individual artworks, working methods, symbolism, and many other things. Has Jimmy Allen arrived? Okay, Jimmy may be here later in the afternoon. He had a commitment this morning. But Haywood Nichols is here. Haywood is an accomplished sculptor who graduated from the Atlanta College of Art. Haywood and Ulysses became friends in 1981. During the next decade, Haywood used his power tools to help Davis rough out and detail pieces. The two saw each other at Haywood's studio or the barber shop once or twice a week, and they were the subjects of a 2-man show in 1990 in Savannah. Haywood, would you stand, please? It was to dealer Jimmy Allen that Davis sold most of the sculptures he was willing to part with, including those in the High's collection. Such an occasion honoring his friend and client is one of the few events that might persuade Jimmy out of his beautiful sanctuary near the Georgia coast, and we are hoping that he will get here later this afternoon. So keep an eye out for Jimmy in the galleries in case he makes that in time. You can talk with all of these folks in the gallery. And now we have a few minutes for questions here, I think. I told you everything that you might wonder.
Does anyone have a question? Maybe they're saving it for the gallery.
Could be.
Did any of the grandchildren or children take up wood carving?
Did any of the grandchildren or children take up wood carving? No, you haven't definitively. But at least one of the grandchildren has taken up another art form, which is photography. Have any of the rest of the children or grandchildren do anything else in the visual arts? Right. That's right. That's right. Yes. That's right. One of Davis's sons, Virgil, was a sculptor and painter. He died very recently, just in the last few months. And in fact, the King Tisdale Cottage Foundation has at least one piece, a relief carving that is primarily, or maybe exclusively, Virgil's work, right? Yes. One of the relief carvings.
How much money did he make, I guess, per sculpting, or what was his highest that he made?
I don't know. I do know that we paid a fairly astronomical sum for the first carving of his that we bought, which is back in the 80s. And that was a first-hand, I mean, it came straight from Jimmy Allen to us, so it wasn't a secondary market piece. So I think is it safe to say that he realized yes. Well, he didn't sell a lot of his work. He didn't like to, so he sold it reluctantly. But when he sold it, was he happy with it? Oh, he didn't tell anybody what he sold it for. Right. Oh, yes, of course. Right. Yes. He and Elizabeth were the only ones who knew what he sold it for, and Jimmy. But in fact, by my calculations, I've been trying to figure out how many works exist. And it appears that there's something over 330 in his total output. And of those, the foundation has 238. There are probably around somewhere between 80 and 90, I think, in private collections. And the others are in a handful of public collections. So altogether, he probably didn't sell more than 90 pieces, maybe. And Jimmy said he knew what were his great pieces, and those were really, really hard to get him to let go of.
Is Mr. Davis buried in Savannah?
Yes. Not a chainsaw, power, right.
The roughing out process was usually fairly simple. He'd bring a board over. He'd sort of tell me what he wanted. We'd make a few pencil marks. I'd cut it out on the bandsaw. And because he was an accomplished metalsmith also, a lot of times he'd make dies and all that would fit in a drill press. So there were some of his pieces that were trees with fruit on it. And I'd put the bit in the drill press, and I'd stand there. And, you know, having been a blacksmith's helper, he knew how you develop twitches and all, and he'd position it, and I'd bring the press down, and then he'd move it, and I'd drill again. I think I was his friend because I had a bandsaw on the drill press. Generally, what you usually would call ordinary tools. They were not specialized tools. He'd have hose punches, pocket knives. I'm trying to think what else I saw in his box of confusion. Just whatever worked. He was enough of a mechanic that he could take any tool and make it do what he wanted done. So generally normal tools was what you would say.
Before he met Haywood, he would use a hatchet to rough out the pieces. And he had a collection of knives, some of which he had specially, he had tooled to modify. And my understanding was that he also used his barber's clippers, or did something, isn't that right? Isn't that how he did the hair? With the blades of the barber clippers? Is that right? Does anybody remember? So he was ingenious and adept at creating his own tools when there wasn't one commercially available.
I'm curious, do you or any of the family members know if there were any, did he ever do any drawings? Did he ever do any drawings? Was his work solely from memory or things that he'd seen? Or?
As a matter of fact, no. And it's interesting because, well, wait a minute. Were there two questions there? You asked about preliminary.
If there were any drawings?
He did not make preliminary sketches. And he said he didn't consider himself an artist because he couldn't draw early on. Early on, he didn't consider himself an artist. He never really drew. He did say that he made a preliminary sketch for the face of Jesus in the crucifixion that's in the Hayes collection that's downstairs. And Haywood remembers doing some drawing for him. He would come to you and say, I need a fish, right? And you draw him a fish, and he'd tell you how to fix it, right? Make it his fish, not your fish. So Haywood did a little bit of drawing for him. But for the most part, he just, as I understand it, he started with that block of wood and it was there. He did sketch on the block. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. He really was a three-dimensional thinker, a three-dimensional artist. And that's also reflected in how much he loved barbering. You know, that's another sculptural skill.
Susan, I realize as a curator you have influence in the entire exhibit and what you selected, but I'm curious on a personal basis if you could select three pieces to go home with you, what you would pick and why.
Well, as its owner well knows, one would be that delightful beast that's, you know, looking over her shoulder. The beast that Daniel saw. That piece with red and green eyes that you saw that I said looks completely different from the front than it does from the side, that's always fascinated me. And I have to say, Thomas, it's one of those situations where, you know, there's my professional judgment, and I know what are the most important works, and then there are the ones that really, you know, that I just love personally, and they're not always the same thing. But personally, I think that that his real masterwork is the crucifixion that we have. Most people consider it to be the president's as a whole, and I think Davis himself considered it to be the Garden of Eden table that he was carving on when he died. That it was actually putting the last pearls on when he died. So there are divergent opinions about that, but I have a really, those creatures and the the creatures from another planet, the created beasts, and those gorgeous Africanized pieces just really, those really, really get me.
I enjoyed your lecture very much.
Thank you.
Which of his works is the earliest in your collection?
The earliest in the High's collection of 9 or the exhibition? Well, I'll tell you both. The earliest thing in the High's collection is that Statue of Liberty, which is from 1939, and that is one of the very earliest pieces we have of his, securely dated. The very earliest piece in existence, as far as we know, is in the exhibition, and it's a little man, a little full-length statue of a man with articulated arms and feet attached by metal pins. He carved it when he was about 10, and it was the first thing that his mother didn't throw into the fire because he'd been carving on the firewood. But that one she saved and kept with her till she died in the 70s.
Do you want to take one more question?
Sure.
Okay.
Where did he find all that wood, all that fine wood that he used?
That's a really good question because it's an interesting question. Firewood. When he was a child, he used firewood. He said sometimes he found wood in the woods. You know, he sort of foraged for it. But most of the wood he used, sometimes he got it in very mundane ways, like buying it from a lumberyard. But he also found wood. People gave it to him, and he used a lot of exotic woods in his carving, particularly mahogany. The way he got that was that he had friends who were longshoremen working on the Savannah docks, and the mahogany would be used as stacking boards for the cargo and freighters, and then when they got into port, it was trash, so they just throw it out. And so his friends would save that kind of wood for him and bring it to him. Also, friends who were longshoremen.
His wood came from, like I said, a lot of sources. The dunnage, which is what the scraps from the packing material. And
It's called dunnage?
dunnage, yeah, is what we've always called it there. And there's no telling what that stuff was, because it was cut wherever they were packing.
Right.
And then sometimes I'd save drops, whenever I was cutting a piece out of something, I'd give him what I thought was a scrap that was in my way, and he'd take it off and do something with it.
Make a magnificent work of art with it.
Well, great, thanks.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Thank you.